This video will cover 8 really strong and stylish samurai-themed builds in Elden Ring. This includes 2 Bloodflame samurai builds that deal incredible bleed damage, 2 Faith Blackflame builds that can melt bosses, 3 magic samurai builds, and finally a Great Katana build. Each weapon and build fits a different playstyle, so I recommend you watch the whole video to find a build that fits your playstyle before committing to one. We'll be covering every weapon and ash of wars you'll use, any spells you might need, any talismans to make the builds 1000% stronger, and of course, the fashion. So let's start with my favorite beginner build, the Bloodflame Samurai. The weapon we're using for this build is the Nagakiba. The reason is because it's the longest katana in the game, pretty much double the reach of the Uchigatana, and that extra reach can really come in handy. Not to mention it just looks really sick. The Nagakiba scales on both strength and dexterity, so you might want to bump those up for maximum damage. Additionally, you get a 1.5 times scaling on strength when you two-hand the weapon, and this is primarily how we're going to use this weapon. So it'll do you good to put some levels into strength, just to get some use out of this. To get the Nagakiba, we'll either have to complete Yura's quest or kill him. It's up to you to decide which way you want to go through with. Personally, I like to use this weapon straight from the start, so I killed him immediately after starting a new game. In that case, you can find Yura here, south of Lake Agil in Limgrave. Pro tip, Yura can hit you like a truck, so use Unsheath on your Uchigatana and you can pretty easily kill him. Now for the weapon skill, we'll be using Double Slash. Double Slash lets you rapidly hit enemies with successive attacks. It also allows up to 2 more follow-up attacks. This is great when combined with Bloodflame Blade, since the rapid successive attacks build up blood loss faster. And Double Slash is also useful to have it be consistent with Corpse Piler on Rivers of Blood, which we'll be using later. Now moving on to the spells we'll be using. First up is Bloodflame Blade. Bloodflame Blade will allow you to apply some extra bleed damage onto your weapon. And combined with Double Slash, we have the chance to build up bleed much faster. Secondly, we're using Flame Grant Me Strength for that 20% buff on physical damage and fire damage. At this point, your build should carry you through the early game pretty well. But now, let's talk about the endgame version of this build. This is a level 150 version of the Bloodflame Samurai. And of course, we're using Rivers of Blood. Rivers of Blood is dropped by Okina near the Church of Repose, found in the mountaintops of the Giants. If you made it to this point in the game using the Bloodflame Nagakiba build, then it would be pretty easy. With this weapon, your primary attack will be your skill. Corpse Piler has extremely long range and does bleed and fire damage. We can also use the Sacrificial Axe in our offhand to gain some FP back every time we kill some enemies. Considering that you should be going with Corpse Piler as much as you can over your light or heavy attacks, the Sacrificial Axe will give us 4 FP with every kill we get. So this is going to help give you your FP back, which will allow you to use this ability much more frequently. This weapon mainly scales on Dex and Arcane. The interesting thing about the scaling on this weapon is, even though Arcane is scaled on D, you'll still come out ahead on damage, and as a bonus, Arcane will increase your blood loss buildup, which means you'll bleed enemies even faster. Now, for the armor. We have a few options between style and function, or a mix of both. Of course, you can stick with the default samurai armor set if you like the look of it. Or we could use the Ronin set, which I personally like the look of. You can also use the Okina mask, which increases your dex by +3. Or the white mask, which will increase your attack power by 10% for 20 seconds if something around you suffers from blood loss. And considering this will happen all the time, this is a significant buff to our build. Now let's check out the Blackflame variation of this build. The weapon we're using for this build is the Nagakiba. The reason being it's the longest katana in the game, pretty much double the reach of the Uchigatana, and that extra reach can really come in handy. Not to mention it just looks really sick. Of course you can use the Uchigatana if you really want to. What's important is that we need to use a weapon which has intrinsic bleeding, meaning the weapon comes with bleed by default and not through any Ashes of War. So 3 amazing early game weapons that can still be buffed by Blackflame Blade or Bloodflame Blade would be the Uchigatana, Nagakiba, or even the Bloodhound's Fang. Bloodflame Blade will only take the intrinsic bleed a weapon has and boost the bleed buildup, causing enemies to bleed faster. Then, With all the Black Flame spells, you're essentially applying a damage over time effect on enemies, while simultaneously building up bleed, which ends up being a very, very deadly combination. Now as for your early game armor, you can use pretty much any set as long as you can mid-roll. In my case, I stuck with the default Reed's Samurai set. But now, let's talk about the mid to end game, level 150 version of this build. So for the weapon, we'll be using the Cross Naginata, just so we can stick with the samurai theme, and like I said before, we need to be using a weapon that has bleed intrinsically. But there is one main reason we're going to use the Naginata, and that's Phantom Slash. Phantom Slash shoots a phantom forward that charges and attacks, which you can then follow up with your own charge and attack. And then you can follow that up with another attack. This gives you 4 hits in the span of a few seconds, and they hit significantly harder than your regular attacks. The cool thing about Phantom Slash is that if your weapon has Black Flame Blade or Bloodflame Blade applied, your Phantom will also have those buffs with its attacks. Another great aspect of this ability is that as soon as you start the animation, even if you get hit, the Phantom will still fire off. This is really useful in scenarios where you need to finish off a weak boss, bleed an enemy, or even in a PvP situation where an enemy is very aggressive. You can mash L2 and stagger them, which might help you get out of that tricky situation. Of course, you can still use the Nagakiba and Sword Dance combination, which is still pretty strong, but Phantom Slash is just stronger, you know. You can also use the Naginata with something like the Repeating Thrust Ash of War plus Bloodflame Blade, but that's more suited for a bleed type build. So even for the level 150 build, we're gonna stick with using the Godslayer Seal. Even if you don't use any of the Black Flame incantations, with 60 faith, it has very good scaling for incantations at this point in the game. In fact, it's probably one of the best seals you can use as a pure faith caster. The armor for this build is pretty sick. I'm using the Ronin set, but you can also have the white mask on for an extra 10% attack power boost whenever bleed happens. Or even better might be the Okina mask, which gives you an extra 3 levels into Dex, which might come useful as our weapon scales on dexterity. Beyond that, you can also use the white Reed set because it's the perfect samurai cosplay. Now, when it comes to talismans, for spells, we're using Golden Vow, Bloodflame Blade, Black Flame Blade, Black Flame, Scouring Black Flame, Black Flame Ritual, and Black Flame's Protection. Golden Vow increases your overall damage by 15%, including weapon skills, regular attacks, and spells. It also boosts your defense, which is crucial for surviving attacks. Black Flame Blade adds a lot of fire damage to each attack. It's particularly effective against enemies that are resistant or immune to bleed. Black Flame is going to be your strong ranged attack. It can also be charged for extra damage. Scouring Black Flame is your AoE ability, hitting enemies in a wide radius. With practice, you'll find that you can wipe out packs of enemies with just one cast. Black Flame Ritual is another excellent spell, especially against aggressive bosses. It creates a circle of black flame that damages enemies inside it. Cast it early in the fight and let enemies walk into it while you follow up with Phantom Slash. Black Flame's Protection increases your physical resistance, allowing you to use Phantom Slash more safely. You'd want to use this in combination with Golden Vow. Alright, so you're not a fan of Bloodflame or the Faith builds. Here are 3 variations of a Moonveil magic build that's perfect for a spellcasting samurai. Plus at the end we're going to talk about a new weapon from the DLC that has one of the coolest moves in the game. So the Moonveil has always been a great early to mid game weapon, mainly because it's strong and it's relatively easy to actually get the weapon. This build takes full advantage of Transient Moonlight, the Moonveil's unique weapon skill. When you hold down your weapon skill, you'll enter this stance. Now, you'll be able to press your light or heavy attacks to send these slicing waves either horizontally or vertically. These attacks have incredible stagger potential, allowing you to break enemy poise and set up for those juicy critical strikes. So how can we make this build even stronger? We just have a few things that will change. First, we're going to grab an Uchigatana and put Frost on it. This way, we can dual wield both the Moonveil and the Frost Uchigatana and be able to proc Frost on enemies. This is great for a mid-game build, since some bosses or enemies would be resistant to magic damage, like Renala for example. So being able to proc Frost is useful. When Frost procs, it not only deals a chunk of damage, but also reduces the enemy's stamina recovery and damage absorption by 20% for 30 seconds. This debuff is especially useful against bosses who seem to have infinite stamina sometimes. Or like I said, magic-resistant enemies where your weapon might deal less damage overall. The beauty of Frost is that it doesn't rely on any specific stat scaling, making it a flexible choice for a lot of builds. Additionally, both the Moonveil and the Starline Sword don't really benefit from being two-handed. It doesn't really get that 1.5 times scaling on strength, so having two swords instead of one will mean you'll be able to proc bleed, frost, and deal damage twice as fast. Also grab the Magic Scorpion Charm. It will increase any magic damage you deal by 12%, which is great for buffing Transient Moonlight's damage. You can use this talisman with the Starline Sword from the DLC build too. The Starline Sword is a unique katana that you can obtain pretty early in the DLC, and just like the Moonveil, it deals double damage, dealing both physical and magic damage. This split damage can be a double-edged sword. The Starline Sword can be really strong against enemies with low magic resistance, and sometimes weak against those with high magic resistance, like Relana, for instance. But this is exactly why we're still sticking to the Frost Uchigatana on the offhand. Just to remind you, Frost procs will deal a lot of damage, reduce enemy stamina, and damage absorption for 30 seconds. What's really cool is the Starline Sword's weapon skill, Onz's Line of Stars. This skill is a combination of multiple chain attacks that are based on how many times you press the follow-up button. The follow-ups to the weapon skill are multiple spinning attacks with a very wide range. There's also this somersault attack that almost always catches enemies off balance. Also, this entire combo manages to stun lock most enemies. By chaining the attacks, you can keep them off balance and potentially take them down without giving them a chance to fight back. It's also excellent for cleaving through groups of enemies due to its extended reach, allowing you to control crowds effectively. Now, unlike the Moonveil, and despite having high intelligence requirements, the Starline Sword doesn't scale that well with int. The weapon actually scales well on dexterity, which means you should focus on pumping that up for maximum damage output. The dexterity scaling far outweighs the others, making it the primary stat for increasing your damage potential. It's also worth noting that the Starline Sword also retains the blood loss buildup typical of katanas, just like the Moonveil. While this isn't the main focus of the weapon, it can be a nice bonus against enemies vulnerable to bleed, especially if you're using the Mimic tier like I am here. You'll find yourself proccing bleed occasionally, giving you a nice burst of extra damage. Finally, remember that the weapon skill is quite FP intensive. A full combo of Onz's Line of Stars costs about 26 FP, which can quickly drain your FP bar if you're not careful. Managing your FP becomes an important part of using this weapon effectively, balancing between regular attacks and judicious use of the weapon skill. And now, while we're still here in the DLC, check out this really strong Great Katana bleed build. The Great Katana is part of a new weapon class introduced in Shadow of the Erdtree. This weapon requires some strength and dexterity to use, and it's much longer and does more damage than a typical katana. Its moveset is what you'd expect from a katana. The running light attack and follow-up has some pretty good reach, and the running R2 attack is a horizontal slash that could be used to hit multiple enemies at the same time. But where this weapon shines is its weapon skill, which is Overhead Stance. While it's not as strong as another Ash of War that you can find early game, which we'll talk about later, Overhead Stance is completely unique to Great Katanas, and a normal attack from this stance is a step forward and a slash downwards, or use a strong attack to deliver a series of 3 downward slashes while stepping forwards. The Great Katana also sets bleeding as a status effect build-up, which is also pretty great. In fact, I have the weapon on Occult Affinity, because it scales really well on Arcane. And Arcane would increase your bleed build-up immensely. This is great if you previously used Rivers of Blood, since you won't need to change your attributes much. Even though Keen Affinity will increase your attack power by about 40, with Arcane scaling your blood loss build-up will be double what it is by default, so you're going to get a lot more bleed triggers if you go with the Occult route. However, if using Bloodflame Blade is important to you, remember you cannot use it with Occult Affinity, in which case you might want to go with Keen. The other Ash of War that you might want to give a try is the Savage Lion's Claw. This is an upgraded version of the Lion's Claw from the base game, allowing you to do 1 additional somersault when you hit L2 twice. It's really good at dealing damage and stance damage, and overall you'll find it more effective than overhead stance. However, it costs quite a bit of FP to use. But hopefully at this point in the game you would have enough FP to manage using Savage Lion's Claw. Now, let's quickly cover the talismans needed. Luckily, most of these builds share talismans with each other, which makes switching between builds much easier if needed. Generally, a great talisman for these builds is the Shard of Alexander, or the Warrior Jar Shard if you're in early game. Either talisman will raise the attack power of skills by a percentage, and considering we're going to be using the weapon skill frequently, using one of these two talismans will always be a great buff. I'm also using the Green Turtle Talisman to be able to recover stamina 17% faster. Or even better is the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, which will boost stamina recovery even faster. And finally, the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to reduce physical damage taken by 20%, and the Bull Goat's Talisman to raise your poise by 33%. Next, the Rotten Winged Insignia, or Millicent's Prosthesis, which would both increase your attack power by a percentage for every successive hit you deal. Finally, there's the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, to increase attack power every time blood loss is triggered, which is probably going to be very often. In fact, this talisman stacks with the White Mask, which also increases your attack power by 10% for 20 seconds if something around you suffers from blood loss. Well, you can use the Carrion Filigreed Crest, which will reduce the FP cost of your skill by 25%. When you're spamming Transient Moonlight, every bit of FP save counts. It's the difference between getting off that final stagger-inducing hit and running dry at the worst possible moment.